The day is October 29th, 1929. Despite having been smashing your hands against the door of the New York bank that closed down, all the money you have saved up for the past decade has vanished. Your hands are bloody and your life is over. What are you going to do? Sadly, the truth is this was the reality for many people in the Great Depression, which didn't exactly start with the stock market crash of '29. The stock market crash happened because of a multitude of factors. Buying on margin, stock speculation, misuse of credit, overproduction, and underconsumption. All of these contributed to the inevitable dip in the economy. However, it was Black Tuesday that truly marked the beginning of the possible end for global prosperity. The United States' disastrously sinking ship of an economy affected the rest of the world due to the globalization that occurred after the Great War. Now, if you take a look at the timeline for this time frame, which the link for which is in the description, I have it right here, of course. It's in the description. You will see that the first major event was, in fact, Black Tuesday. Now, it wasn't the market crash that made the Great Depression so terrible. It was the massive unemployment. What followed the market crash was a cycle of deflation, where prices dropped, employers had to lay off workers, and the banks couldn't give companies the money for payroll, which was a big problem. This led to a huge cycle of just debt, economy sinking, more unemployment, again and again and again and again. So, what did the current president, Herbert Hoover, and his administration do in response to this deflationary cycle? They raised tariffs to the highest rates in history with the Hawley-Smoot tariff. The idea was to protect American industry, but European countries retaliated with their own tariffs, okay, which led to a decrease in American goods, sales, and jobs, which was the exact opposite effect of what was supposed to happen. Nice going, Hoover. Just like I just did right now, many American citizens got upset with Hoover despite it not being solely the president's fault. They mocked his political inaction, however, by naming shanty towns Hoovervilles. So they mocked him anyways, despite it not actually being really his fault. It was a combination of everyone's fault. It was everyone's fault, especially the people's fault. And the wealthy people, the stock speculators, and those people. Especially the people who just kept on misusing credit. Like, they used their credit, meaning they took a loan from someone, or they said, oh yeah, I'll pay you back later, and then they never did. And they would do that for everything. So they just get whatever they wanted, pay it off later, when they would never actually pay it back. And the way they did pay it back was by taking a loan from the banks, which was, yeah, that's the reason why everything went down. So this coalesced into FDR's victory in 1932, the only Democratic president since Woodrow Wilson. FDR is famous for his New Deal reforms, all of which you can look at in the New Deal programs chart, link also in the description, and I have it right here. So, link in the description if you want to read it. It's going to give you a lot more detail than I am in this video. This video is just an overview. As you can see, no topics here, no subtopics here, just the name of the lesson, period 7.5, which is from 1929 to 1945. So, yeah. If you want a greater, more into detail lesson plan, check the description. Did these reforms actually help soothe the Depression? Not really, but they did help boost the morale and hope in the citizens of the nation. It enabled them to believe that things could possibly get better despite only the temporary relief and recovery that FDR's New Deal produced. Now, FDR had three R's program: relief, recovery, and reform. He did none of those. Because his relief was temporary, his recovery didn't really start until World War II, and then he died shortly after his fourth term started. And reform, pretty much all of his New Deal reforms were overturned by the court. So he didn't really do anything. But we like to say that he did because he actually tried to do something in contrast to Herbert Hoover's presidency. Now, if it wasn't the New Deal, what really brought the United States out of the Great Depression? Most likely, it was World War II, and the investments the country made during the war regarding its excellent manufacturing and weapons development. So now we'll shift over. Let's take a look at the life of the people during the Depression, and we'll take a deeper look at the home front during World War II. So during the Depression, life was hard, of course. It was the Depression. Now, millions of people who had lived through the Great Depression and hard times of the 1930s never got over it. They developed a depression mentality, an attitude of insecurity and economic concern that would always remain, even in times of prosperity. During the Depression, added pressures were placed on the family as unemployed fathers searched for work, and declining incomes presented severe challenges for mothers for the feeding and clothing for their children. To supplement the family income, more women sought work, and the percentage of the total labor force increased. Of course, not by a large amount, because Great Depression, 25% unemployment, 1 in 4 people were unemployed. Dust Bowl farmers. That's going to be a fun topic, isn't it? As if farmers did not already have enough problems, a severe drought in the early 1930s ruined crops in the Great Plains. Wow, look at that. Great Depression? Ooh, now your crops are dead too. Sucks. What are you going to do about it? Oh, nothing. That's right, nothing. Now, you can read The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck to learn more about the Dust Bowl, because he'll know a lot more about the life of farmers in the Dust Bowl than I will, because I'm like 17. I don't know anything about that. I wasn't there. He was. So, you should read The Grapes of Wrath. Just a recommendation. So, in response to one of the worst ecological disasters in American history, the federal government created the Soil Conservation Service in 1935 to teach and subsidize the plains farmers to rotate crops, terrace fields, use contour plowing, and plant trees to stop soil erosion and conserve water. It worked, because it still exists today. Now, racial discrimination continued in the 1930s with devastating effects on the African Americans, who were last hired, first fired. Their unemployment rate was higher than the national average. Black sharecroppers were forced off the land in the South because of cutbacks in the farm production. Often, despite the extreme poverty, jobless African Americans were excluded from state and local relief programs. Some New Deal programs such as WPA and the CCC did provide low-paying jobs for African Americans, though these jobs were often segregated. Segregated, however, is still better than no job at all. So then you also have the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was an executive order in 1941, which set up a committee to assist minorities in gaining jobs in defense industries. President Roosevelt took this action only after A. Philip Randolph, head of the Railroad Porters Union, threatened to march on Washington to demand equal job opportunities for African Americans. So then you also have a problem with American Indians. So you have the Indian Reorganization, or Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934. So Collier, a longtime advocate for American Indian rights, won Roosevelt's support for a major change in policy regarding American Indians. In 1934, Congress repealed the Dawes Act of 1887, which had encouraged American Indians to be independent farmers, and replaced it with the Indian Reorganization Act. The new measure returned lands to the control of tribes and supported preservation of Indian cultures. Despite this major reform, critics later accused the New Deal of being paternalistic and withholding control from American Indians. So now let's talk about the home front in World War II. The success of the U.S. and Allied armed forces depended on mobilizing America's people, industries, and creative and scientific communities. The role of the federal government expanded well beyond anything in World War I or the New Deal. As in World War I, the U.S. government organized a number of special agencies to mobilize the U.S. economy and military resources for the wartime crisis. This is probably the most likely reason for why we were able to exit out of the Great Depression. Early in 1942, the War Production Board, or the WPB, was established to manage war industries. Later, the Office of War Mobilization, or OWM, set production priorities and controlled raw materials. The government used a cost-plus system, in which it paid war contractors the cost of production plus a certain percentage for profit. One federal agency, the Office of Price Administration, or OPA, regulated almost every aspect of civilians' lives by freezing prices, wages, and rents, and rationalizing such commodities as meat, sugar, gasoline, and auto tires, primarily to fight wartime inflation. So you have this huge you also have this huge spread of wartime propaganda, workers and unions, and financing the war, as well as an increase in business and industry. Now, the war also had an impact on society, such as on African Americans, which, attracted by jobs in the North and West, over 1.5 million African Americans left the South. In addition, 1 million young men left home to serve in the armed forces, whether as soldiers or civilians. All faced continued discrimination and segregation. Civil rights leaders encouraged African Americans to adopt a double V slogan, one for victory over fascism abroad and one for equality at home. Now, you also have the Japanese internment camps, which was essentially like the concentration camps, but not as bad. Now, almost 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally in the military of America. Nevertheless, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were suspected of being potential spies and saboteurs, but not German Americans or Italian Americans. I guess it's really just racism and discrimination. So that's it for this time frame, and next time we will talk about the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement.